Following the introduction of the RS-11, Alco's products became somewhat scattered and misfocused. These products for the most part meant well, but unfortunately for Alco, didn't really do all that well. Alco at this point decided to take a strange path in which it would produce small locomotives for niches in the actual locomotive purchasing market for the domestic United States. This particular technique had served Alco very well in the past, as back in the steam era, it was very common for steam locomotives to be custom-built machines, built for a specific use on a specific railroad. Back then, labor was cheap, so high maintenance wasn't an issue. Unfortunately for Alco, things had changed. With an ever tighter overheads over them, railroads basically found themselves not being able to afford massive back shops. Standardized maintenance became the requirement on all diesel engines to keep overhead to a minimal. This is to say, 6 axles like the RSD-12 we rolled by, which were specially built for the Santa Fe and a few other railroads, would prove to be far too expensive to operate due to their special maintenance needs and requirements due to non-standard parts and overall different designs. In short, railway companies were looking for locomotives that conformed and did not stick out, therefore not requiring special parts or specialized maintenance. All of these things would help keep maintenance to a minimal as well as the cost of maintenance down, something that would become ever more critical as the situation got worse for railroads during the 1960s and 70s. The first locomotive that could be considered part of this unusual string of models for Alco is the RSD-12, and as its name implied, this is essentially a 6-axle variant of the RS-11. The 6 axles offered more tragic effort, especially at low speeds and pulling long trains, but the locomotive gained no increase in horsepower in the process, still rated at 1800 horsepower, the same as the RS-11. Only 171 of these monsters were produced. The largest purchaser was the Ferrocarriles Nacionales de Mexico, aka the National Railroads of Mexico, with 73 units. Few domestic railroad companies would actually buy this locomotive, the largest one being domestically the Southern Pacific Railroad with 21 units. The West Tennessee units we've been viewing are actually from the first order of the RSD-12s, which were by the C&O Railroad, aka the Chesapeake and Ohio. The next locomotive that comes up in this line of unusual engines from Alco is the RSD-15. The low-nosed version of this particular model has gained the nickname Alligator due to the length of the low short hood. This behemoth puts out a whopping 2,400 horsepower. The trucks on this locomotive featured uneven wheel spacing to help accommodate the traction motors. Unfortunately for Alco, this locomotive proved to be way too far ahead of its time. The engine itself came out in an era where the old railroaders were only warming up to the diesel, and their logic was 4-axle engines all the way. Alco's logic, which made perfect sense with this engine in terms of the maintenance and operating requirements, was that it could do the work of 2 locomotives, but for less than half the cost. Even if it did cost more than a single 4-axle locomotive to operate. Essentially, though, the railroads looked at this as simply being a very expensive engine to operate and did not understand the idea of basically being able to do the work of 2 engines put together in one smaller package. Although admittedly it wasn't much of a smaller package considering its extreme length, which was the other principal problem with this particular locomotive. It was essentially to these railroad companies like trying to park an oversized 1950s car in a big city like New York City. Essentially, parking would be the problem, and facilities may have to be adjusted just to accommodate these behemoths. The Santa Fe was the largest purchaser of this particular locomotive, going for about 50 of them. While the Duluth-Mesabi Iron Range took 6, the Pennsylvania Railroad also 6, the Southern Pacific Railroad with 3, the St. Louis Southwestern Railway, which is a division of the Southern Pacific Railroad, with 10, and the Canadian Pacific Railroad with just 1. An interesting note on the CP Rail locomotive, it was actually known as an RSD-17, built by the Montreal Locomotive Works. The locomotive was actually supposed to go into production but failed to generate any orders, and so the particular model that was in fact finally sold to CP Rail was renamed the Empress of Agent Court, as it was a unique one-off locomotive. Another interesting note on the RSD-15 is that there were in fact some high-nosed variants of this locomotive produced, all were for the Duluth-Mesabi and Iron Range Railroad, spanning the railway company's entire order of 6 units. This particular example of an RSD-15 that we're viewing has a very interesting history. They started their careers off on the Santa Fe and were eventually sold to the Lake Superior and Ishpeming Railroad. From there, they were acquired by the Green Bay and Western Sister Railroad, the Fox River Railroad. Unfortunately, the heavy amounts of use, both hauling iron ore as well as running along on the Santa Fe Railroad, took their toll, and these engines quickly developed major mechanical problems while on the Green Bay route. They eventually found themselves in long-term storage, then slowly but surely scrapped. This particular locomotive is the only survivor of this particular group of engines. Number 2407, as seen above, was donated to the Illinois Railroad Museum sometime in the late 90s, narrowly avoiding the cutting torch. The locomotive was donated, interestingly enough, with a seized prime mover. The engine sat on static display for several years until sometime in the early 2000s, a mechanic that had started volunteering for the museum was able to unjam the prime mover and get it running. The locomotive has been known to be a bit on the unreliable side, as these engines were heavily worn out, but a lot of TLC from the museum has helped make this locomotive a much more reliable and enjoyable runner. Our next locomotive sort of doubles down on the whole theme of means well but didn't do well. The RS-27 was essentially an RSD-15 squashed down into a smaller package. Essentially, Alco, noticing it was getting a lot of demand for engines that were of higher power but in smaller sizes, decided to reutilize the old RS-11 frame, which was now sort of outdated with its 1800 horsepower. Using what could be described as the world's largest shoehorn, they managed to squeeze a massive 16-cylinder 251 type prime mover into this unit, allowing it to produce a whopping 2400 horsepower, wow, in this small of a size. Now, one might think that this is the ultimate engine and it's sold like hotcakes for Alco. Finally, Alco found the perfect product to sell for the sort of mid to late 50s crowd of the locomotives, sales, etc. Unfortunately, no. To quote a famous TV character, "You can't bend the laws of physics, Captain." And that's pretty much exactly what happened here. It comes down to power to weight. Now, normally one thinks more power to the weight, better result, and that's the usual concept. Here it's a little bit different, especially with the locomotive. The contact patch a locomotive's wheel sits on, at least in the United States, is the equivalent of a single American nickel. That's not a lot of space, and so the rule is for the horsepower you increase, you have to increase the weight as well. Just the opposite was done here. The weight was dramatically reduced, not much more than what the RS-11 had, and unfortunately, on top of everything else, the locomotive lost 2 more axles. This further aggravated the power-to-weight ratio. The end result, the consistent tractic effort of this particular locomotive was less than that of the RS-11 it replaced. Specifically, while the RS-11 managed 64,325 pounds of consistent tractic effort with its 1800 horsepower, the RS-27 could only manage, at best, 64,200 pounds of tractic effort. Now, that's a small decrease, but still, when one buys a more powerful, more expensive locomotive, one expects an increase for that increased investment, and/or an improvement for the newer model, and unfortunately, RS-27 failed to deliver on this. Only 27 of these locomotives were produced, and no, that's not why it was named this, it was simply the 27th in line of production and/or development at the Alco Locomotive Works or American Locomotive Works. Most of these locomotives were quickly scrapped and/or in some way or other traded in for replacements. The only 2 remaining engines have now wound up on the Minnesota Commercial Railroad. They are both former Chicago Northwestern engines, which were purchased by the Green Bay and Western, when that railroad in turn was acquired by the Wisconsin Central, who of course found the Alcos unworthy of its railroad. They promptly decided to trade them to the small and at that point up-and-coming Minnesota Commercial Railroad for 2 of their SW series switchers. While both numbers 316 and 317 remain on the Minnesota Commercial, at least for the time being, as I understand 317 has suffered a mechanical failure in more recent times and is currently out of service. Normally it would be a common sense answer that this engine would be put back into service. Unfortunately, however, things have changed on the Minnesota commercial. The railroad has become increasingly more GE and EMD laden, and the Alcos are less and less in existence. In fact, besides the two RS-27s, there's only one other Alco, and that is a C424, which apparently has been permanently demoted to a yard switcher. But again, this locomotive was a flop for Alco, a miserable one at that, and one that Alco really couldn't afford anymore, as GE, its longtime partner, which produced all the electric motors and helped out on the turbochargers, etc. for its engines, was now a competitor, introducing its U-25B in 1959. This would mean a huge increase in the price that Alco paid for the electronics for its locomotives, traction motors, etc. Alco would need to take a more disciplined approach to its next locomotive and not fall into the trap of making a specialty engine for a specific railroad company to fill a niche in their particular demands. Alco decided to tackle a very popular new locomotive released by EMD called the GP20. Notable, this particular engine, as if to steal a page from Alco's playbook, was the first EMD locomotive to feature a turbocharger. Incorporated to EMD's popular 567 prime mover, the new variation was called the 567D2. A two-stroke, again, 16-cylinder locomotive. Alco decided it could do better with these specifications, and promptly looked to its old warhorse, the RS-11's platform again, but this time they would use their heads. Instead of going for a whopping 2,400 horsepower and shoehorning the massive 16-cylinder engine in it, which caused the cab to be compressed down to a small size and produced unusable extra horsepower, not to mention increasing the fuel bills for the engine, the company would take its 251B type prime mover, again with 12 cylinders, and add a supercharger to the already turbocharged prime mover. This would allow the engine to make 2,000 horsepower, same as the EMD, but again with just 12 cylinders and with 4-cycle combustion. The end result, the engine's fuel bills were roughly 30 to 50% less than what the EMD product had. In addition, thanks to a much more modest increase over the RS-27's infamous 2,400 horsepower 16-cylinder monster, at just 200 horsepower from 1800 up to 2000, the locomotive had a much more consistent tractic effort and was able to therefore take advantage of its extra horsepower. Modern transistorized electronics debuted in this locomotive, assisting the engine in being more effective in terms of using its power to its traction motors, avoiding wheel slippage, and really getting every last ounce of power down to the rails. Overall, this engine really set the company into a new direction. Unfortunately, like all the other engines in this particular part of my Alco Road Switcher series, it was a flop, only selling a whopping 35 units. 25 went to the Alco sort of lover, I guess you could say New York Central, which finally found a product they could justify purchasing in a bigger number from Alco, and only 10 went to the Southern Pacific Railroad. Interesting note on the 10 units the Southern Pacific Railroad acquired. After not working out on long-haul freights and other such assignments, they would be moved to the Peninsula Corridor commuter area of the railroad, located in San Francisco and what would eventually be known as Silicon Valley. These particular engines could also be seen during the time they were assigned to this task, which was the basically remainder of their lives with the railroad, subbing for commuter train locomotives, specifically the Trainmasters, as they were still in service in those days, although the Trainmasters by this point in the 60s were nearing the end of their lives as well. Interesting note on number 2035. It was one of the original locomotives ordered for the New York Central, the only other and actual main purchaser of this engine from Alco. Its current owner is the Genesee Valley Transportation Group, which has it assigned to its Falls Railroad line. As to why this locomotive didn't do so well for Alco, especially since it seemed to have all the winning traits that a locomotive that would succeed for Alco would have, including targeting a market, the GP20 from EMD, and the railroads that were purchasing it, Also, the fact that Alco had targeted 2,000 horsepower to be a, quote, sweet spot in what was being requested and required by railroads of the day. Then, of course, there was the elephant in the room, if you will. GE, the former partner of Alco, which, as I mentioned earlier, was now a competitor, and the U-25B, which, while it didn't outsell EMD, with just 478 U-25s produced, it would not be a hard conclusion that some of those sales would have normally gone to Alco had GE not existed in the locomotive business. Although GE's locomotives would actually suffer major problems, especially in their early years. The difference was, however, and unfortunately for Alco, is that GE had very deep pockets. If you were to run into a problem with one of GE's locomotives, say the U-25B for example, and the company happened to have a new one in production, they were likely to send a team of blow-dried and well-dressed salesmen and women out to your railroad to convince you of the value of GE products by offering you pretty much almost full value on whatever engine you were having problems with toward the new locomotive. GE could afford this, and while EMD thought this is foolish, being the fact that, of course, a lot of cash was being lost in the process, GE was playing the long game, and it would eventually put them in a position that would dominate not just Alco, but EMD as well. The next and final locomotive I'd like to discuss in this part of my Alco Road Switcher documentary is the Alco RS-36. Essentially, this engine was a revised variant of the 251B propelled RS-11, with a chopped nose, modern electronics, adjustments to make the cab more comfortable for the crew to operate the engine and provide better visibility, and overall just updated all around. While the engine prime mover was updated, it still maintained just 1,800 horsepower. This was accomplished by simply removing the supercharger from the engine's prime mover. Note the difference in how the locomotive accelerates, as you do not get that supercharger whine or whistle as the engine's prime mover is sped up. Alco was specifically targeting or going after its old customers, hoping that they would order this locomotive to complement their existing fleets, specifically of the RS-11s. Specifically the Delaware and Hudson and the Nickel Plate Road Railroad, as well as the Norfolk and Western Railway, hoping to at least get moderate numbers of orders from these particular companies and in turn generate more revenue for the company. Unfortunately, whether it was the downturn in the railway companies at this time, with increasing government regulations beginning to apply pressure, and the loss of revenue from passenger trains due to competition from cars, planes, and buses, not to mention a massive loss of freight business to trucks from the railroads, or just overall bad luck for Alco, few sales were generated of this engine. The engine was slightly more successful than the predecessor of the RS-32, with a total sale of 40 locomotives. Still, this number paled in comparison of what Alco was hoping. It was hoping to at least get 30 or 40 engines apiece from the companies. Instead, it barely generated that in total with all of them involved. Further aggravating this unfortunate situation for Alco was the fact that it was facing strikes. The engine we're viewing here, number 5017, is a former Delaware and Hudson Railroad locomotive, and yes, you can pretty clearly tell by its paint scheme. By the time this footage was shot, it was working for CP, or Canadian Pacific Rail, as they had acquired the Delaware and Hudson sometime in 1992, after a disastrous merger with Guilford Transportation, who were trying very hard to get the Delaware and Hudson under the same labor rates that the company operated under, specifically that of the Springfield Terminal Railroad it owned. The end result of this tension led to a massive strike that forced the government to get involved. This in turn would lead the Guilford Transportation Company to declare the D&H bankrupt and essentially give possession of it over to the railway employees of the D&H at that time. The New York, Susquehanna, and Western would operate the railroad during this period in time of 1 year before it was decided by the railroad company employees to sell the company off to CP Rail. These Alcos, of course, went with the purchase as well. CP Rail was only too happy to have them, as they had a lot of experience and good experience with their own domestic version of the RS-32/11 called the RS-18. Built by MLW, or the Montreal Locomotive Works, an Alco subsidiary since its inception in the early 1900s, many of those engines at this time were still in service and looked a lot like the RS-36, as various modernization programs updated their electronics and chopped their noses. Incidentally, this locomotive continues to live on to this day. After being retired in the mid-90s by the CP Rail Corporation, it was sold to the Delaware and Ulster Railroad in Catskill, New York. It was fully restored and now holds tourist trains around the Catskills. One common link between all of these engines, as I mentioned from the beginning of this video, is that they were all flops, and costly ones for Alco for the most part. While the company made some cash on them, I should say, the problem was it wasn't simply enough, as more and more labor relations issues, higher wage demands, and other such industry pressures began to really push down hard on the company. Not to mention the fact that GE was now a competitor and still its main electronics and other such component supplier for its locomotives. And, needless to say, because GE was now a competitor and not a partner, Alco was no longer getting favorable rates on the traction motors and other electronic components it needed to build its locomotives. In short, the pressure was on Alco. It was do or die time, either come up with a range of locomotives that customers wanted to buy, or go over the falls and essentially go out of business. These demands would cause Alco to come up with a whole new line of locomotives called the Century Series. This would unfortunately be the last series of locomotives Alco would ever produce as a domestic locomotive manufacturer. I'll be covering these locomotives in my next part of this documentary, the Century Series locomotives. And before I close out, I'd like to give my heartfelt thanks to all of those who participated in making this film by letting me use their video footage. Thank you very much, everybody. Couldn't have done it without you. And that brings us to the end of this third part of my Alco Road Switchers documentary. If you liked it, please give a thumbs up and subscribe. If not, feel free to thumbs down it. Thank you very much for watching again. And as always, keep the metal side down.